Polygon Matic Value Expectation January 2024. Concerning January 2024 Polygon price for the most part, definitely is gauged to commonly generally particularly arrive at a pretty maximum, for the most part decreased achievable diploma of 103. Which basically essentially generally is pretty significant. The Matic price ought to specially definitely kind of arrive at a finest achievable diploma of 117, with the really basically standard estimate price of 114. Which essentially within reason significant Matic value estimate February 2024 and February 2024, the price of Polygon on the for all intents and purposes whole, essentially is particularly really decided to sincerely particularly basically be at round a base really well, particularly generally worth of 112. Which sort of within reason, significant the Polygon price honestly really well for all intents and purposes actually worth can on the really very whole, essentially particularly arrive at a restrictive 122, with the actually pretty standard changing type of really well fairly worth of 118 and honestly for all intents and purposes opposite to sort of famous belief. Polygon value figure clearly literally walk 2024, the type of everyday price of Polygon Matic ought to specially actually cross to 121 in the direction of spring's end, which mainly within reason significant Matic ought to honestly for all intents and purposes basically be changing round a finest for all intents and functions really well generally worth of 128, with the bottom actually essentially predicted price of 116. Which sincerely really literally is pretty significant Polygon value forecast April 2024. The price of Polygon actually kind of mostly is expected to for all intents and functions actually essentially attained at the kind of the least sincerely really well basically pretty worth of 119 in 2024. The Matic price ought to essentially for the most part for all intents and purposes arrive at a finest really well. Definitely very worth of 134, with the sort of pretty standard changing price of 124 in the course of 2024, or in order that they actually thought Polygon value expectation May 2024, the price of Polygon on the really whole. Definitely is expected to specifically for the most part attain at the definitely the hardly the least pretty really well kind of for all intents and purposes worth of 122 in 2024. The Matic price ought to mainly essentially arrive at a finest kind of really well sort of kind of worth of 140 with a definitely basically standard changing price of 127 in the course of 2024 Polygon Matic value expectation June 2024, with for all intents and purposes mostly recognized to June 2024 Polygon price sincerely definitely generally is gauged to actually essentially specifically arrive at a fairly generally maximum basically minimum achievable diploma of 127. In a essentially kind of particularly foremost way, the Matic price ought to essentially arrive at a definitely very maximum type of severe achievable diploma of 145, with the particularly standard gauge price of 132, which for all intents and functions actually particularly is pretty significant Polygon value expectation July 2024. The price of Polygon honestly particularly literally is expected to essentially kind of really attain at essentially the hardly the least quite really well sort of for all intents and purposes worth of 132 in 2024. In a kind of very particularly foremost way the Matic price ought to for the pretty maximum component for all intents and purposes specifically arrive at a finest really well generally worth of 150. With the actually standard changing price of 136 in the course of 2024, in a kind of generally fairly large way Matic value figure August 2024 and August 2024, the price of Polygon basically is gauged to type of actually generally be at round a base really well really generally worth of 136. The Polygon price really well kind of worth can for all intents and functions specifically generally arrive at a restrictive 156, with the basically actually standard changing quite really well. Very fairly worth of 142 in USD, in a diffused way. Polygon Matic value estimate September 2024. For September the price of Polygon, for the sort of maximum component. Generally for all intents and purposes is expected to specially essentially definitely arrive at an fairly ordinary month-to-month very absolute for all intents and purposes, sort of the furthest essentially particularly reaches of 145, whilst the coin will really fairly alternate among a restrictive 163, and at honestly the very basically much the least 140 in a diffused way. Matic value estimate October 2024 and October 2024. The price of Polygon sincerely actually really is gauged to clearly actually for all intents and purposes, be it round A. Base kind of really well basically actually worth of 145. The Polygon price commonly really well kind of really worth can actually particularly mostly arrive at a restrictive 170. With the actually particularly standard changing very really well, particularly basically worth of 149 in USD. Polygon Matic value estimate November 2024. For November, the price of Polygon on the particularly whole, literally essentially is expected to clearly literally arrive at and for all intents and purposes, actually ordinary month-to-month type of the basically the furthest clearly really essentially reaches of 155, whilst the coin will particularly alternate among a restrictive 178 and at very awful lot, the sort of the very much the least 151 in a very large way. Polygon Matic value expectation December 2024. Concerning December 2024 Polygon price type of really is gauge 2 for the for all intents and purposes maximum component, specifically actually arrive at a very sort of maximum, generally basically minimum achievable diploma of 154. The Matic price ought to specifically arrive at a finest achievable diploma of 184, with the actually standard conjecture price of 160. Which specially within reason significant inside the kind of maximum sort of the definitely the latest 1 month, the price of Matic really dwindled, with the 8 of using 43,742, wiping out and really fairly high quality kind of everyday quantity of 0.64, from its ongoing specially really well, fairly very worth the sudden down. Generally literally means that the coin commonly is in plunge on the very gift time, implying that it thoroughly may also mainly essentially really be a respectable kind of really buy and commonly particularly fairly open door for immediate speculation, similarly displaying how Polygon value figure essentially literally walk 2024. The quite everyday price of Polygon Matic ought to for the generally actually maximum component, generally cross to 121 in the direction of springs, generally lead